The room smells of beeswax and damp parchment. 3 scribes huddle over low tables, transcribing every word, every moan, every plea. An episcopal notary verifies the seals, confirming the presence of witnesses required by protocol. 2 clergymen, a representative of the bishop, a doctor. On the limestone wall, a niche holds the record book. Brown leather cover, bronze clasp, numbered pages. Everything has a fee. The candle drips onto the brazier. The iron heats up. The procedure begins punctually at Vespers, as stipulated in the diocesan charter of 1238. It's not chaos. It's a system. A legal canonical mechanism that transforms declared mercy into method, suffering into documentary proof, clemency into accounted routine. The records do not lie. Souls were saved, costs were collected, order was maintained. Would you have signed the document without reading it, trading the public bonfire for this? Leave your opinion, and we'll continue with the story. To understand how the medieval church built one of the most sophisticated bureaucracies in European history, not just of faith, but of control, documentation, and revenue, we need to go back to the 13th century when the papacy faced its greatest internal threat since Arianism. Heresies that spread faster than the response capacity of decentralized dioceses. What began as theological concern quickly transformed into an administrative problem, then a fiscal one, then an architectural one. It was necessary not only to identify heretics, but to process them, judge them, punish them, and crucially, document each step. The salvation of souls required paperwork. And this entire machine, courts, scribes, jailers, doctors, confessors, needed to be financed. What will be revealed here is not just cruelty, but institutional engineering, how the church transformed penitence into protocol, suffering into legal proof, and mercy into a bureaucratic monopoly. The initial hope was genuine. When Dominicans and Franciscans began to preach against Cathars and Waldensians in the south of France, the stated goal was persuasion, conversion, through example and word. The first public debates in Coventry, Liverpool, and Newcastle attracted crowds, prepared theologians, curious populations, merchants who closed their workshops to listen. And heresy, according to the episcopal logic of the time, grew like a weed. Each day of delay allowed more souls to be contaminated, more families to abandon the sacraments, more tithes to stop flowing into diocesan coffers. The turning point came in 1233, with the papal bull that established formal procedures for inquiring, judging, and sentencing suspects of heresy. It was not just authorization to act. It was an operational manual. How many judges per court? How many witnesses required? How long of preventive detention? What penalties for repeat offenders? How to divide confiscated goods between church and crown? The document had 47 clauses. The 13th dealt with accepted methods for stimulating memory and softening obstinacy. From the council to the dungeon, the path was surprisingly short. Cathedrals were reformed, basements expanded, walls reinforced, windows narrowed. In Coventry, the bishop hired a master mason from Newcastle who had already worked in royal prisons. The budget included wrought iron, wall hooks, chains with adjustable rings. Each item had a list price. Each service was recorded in the episcopal ledger. A local blacksmith provided the first order. 6 chairs with metal frames, perforated seats, articulated arms. The design was not original. It adapted techniques used in military interrogations during the Crusades, but with a fundamental innovation: indirect, prolonged, controllable heating, embers under the structure, not direct flames. The difference was crucial. It allowed duration, modulation, interruption, and resumption. It transformed an instrument of quick execution into a tool of prolonged inquiry. The blacksmith charged £85 tournois for the complete order, plus £16 for annual maintenance. The invoice was filed. Everything was filed. The protocol developed in Coventry became a model. Before the procedure, a mandatory medical examination, not out of compassion, but out of legal pragmatism. A death during interrogation invalidated. The confession and created martyrs. The doctor determined the maximum duration, mandatory intervals, and amount of water allowed. Then came the notary, who read in Latin the articles of accusation and the questions formulated by the inquisitor. The accused swore to tell the truth. Only then did what the documents called the question begin, a neutral, bureaucratic word that camouflaged the method. Scribes transcribed everything, answers, silences, screams recorded as gemitus or clamor, confessions noted word for word. Each session generated 3 to 8 pages of parchment, filed in bundles, sealed with episcopal wax. The Archive of Coventry held, in 1310, more than 2,000 complete cases. It weighed tons. It employed 6 permanent archivists. The bureaucracy of suffering was also logistics, storage, classification. The records do not lie. Each scream had a date, time, and witnesses. And the archive justified the system. The local nobility quickly realized the opportunity. Goods of condemned heretics were confiscated and divided. 1/3 for the bishop, 1/3. For the crown, 1/3 for the denouncer. Rival families accused each other, using ecclesiastical courts as weapons in disputes of inheritance, borders, and precedence. Merchants saw another angle. Condemned heretics lost contractual rights, debts were cancelled, properties auctioned below value. In Liverpool, a consortium of textile merchants bought 17 confiscated workshops for a derisory price, consolidating a monopoly on wool dyeing. The local bishop received a voluntary donation of £100. The notary who certified the sales received a 3% commission. Scribes charged for an authenticated copy of each sentence. Jailers received a fixed salary plus a fee per prisoner. 2 pence per day for basic food, 6 pence if the family wanted to send better food. Doctors visited the cells monthly, charging a consultation fee. Confessors heard weekly repentances, receiving a diocesan stipend. Even bakers and butchers participated, providing contracted rations for the episcopal prisons. The system did not work despite the complicity. It worked because of it. It was a machine oiled by interest, each gear lubricated by coins counted, weighed, and recorded. The judicial ritual had its own liturgy. Trials took place on fixed days, usually Sundays after solemn mass, in the cathedral courtyard or adjacent square. The bishop presided, flanked by canons and representatives of the chapter. A herald read the sentences aloud, starting with the lightest, public penances, fasts, pilgrimages, and ending with the most severe, life. Imprisonment, delivery to the secular arm for execution. The crowd watched in obligatory silence. Guards positioned at regular intervals ensured order. Each sentence was followed by a fixed formula in Latin, then translated into the vernacular. Those condemned to prison received a grey habit marked with a yellow cross on the back, a visible, permanent sign that would identify them for the rest of their lives if they were released. The symbolism was calculated. Mercy, they were spared from death. Justice, public punishment. Pedagogy, example for others. But there was a more subtle calculation. Perpetual prisoners were labor. In Newcastle, condemned Cathars worked on the expansion of the episcopal palace, carrying stones, digging foundations, building their own prison. In Coventry, they wove coarse cloth sold by the diocese to finance their own incarceration. The records do not lie. Between 1240 and 1320, the episcopal prisons of Dorset generated a net income of £3,000. After deducting costs for guards, food and maintenance, repentance had market value. In the convent of St. Charlotte, near Leeds, the Mother Superior, Elizabeth Wilson, maintained an iron regime, literally. All decisions were recorded in a book with a metal cover locked with a key. kept in an ark with 3 locks, one key with the abbess, another with the prioress, a third with the treasurer. Each page had a margin for notes, name of the nun, transgression, penalty applied, duration, observations on health and behavior. The language was clinical. Sister Sarah, lukewarmness in the choir, 7 days of moderate fasting, water and hosts, supervision of the head nurse. The term moderate fasting was defined in the internal statute, common bread in the form of an unconsecrated host, theological cruelty disguised as clemency, as it reminded the nuns of the denied sacrament while they remained at fault. The head nurse checked pulse and tongue daily, noting signs of extreme weakness. When a nun fainted, she was removed, fed slowly with barley broth until she regained minimal strength, then transferred to a monastic hospital in a distant region, Munich, Frankfurt, sometimes Bremen. In fact, many never appeared in the convent documents again. They disappeared from the archive, then from history. St. Charlotte maintained an impeccable reputation for generations. Bishops praised the discipline. Noble families sent daughters. Donations accumulated. And the treasurer noted, each quarter, that the costs with the infirmary had decreased. Fewer sick nuns meant savings with doctors, medicines, special food. Penance was also efficient management. When the Catholic monarchs unified the kingdoms of Castile and Aragon, they also unified the Inquisition, creating for the first time a court, directly subordinate to the crown, not to the papacy. The difference was fundamental. It changed the nature of control, the direction of the revenue flow, the logic of the operation. In Aragon, royal inquisitors settled in Coventry with their own budget, a fixed staff of employees, and a codified salary table. A chief torturer, a royal office with letters patent, a monthly salary of 12 gold florins plus bonuses for extraordinary services, supervised 2 assistants, and maintained an inventory of equipment: chains, ropes, weights, wooden wedges, short-handled hammers. Each item had a registration number engraved in iron. Each use was noted in its own book: date, process, duration, result. The language was aseptic: application of ordinary method, extraction of voluntary confession, session of memory stimulation. Never torture, a word that did not appear in official documents. The euphemism was not simple hypocrisy. It was a legal necessity, as treaties between Christian kingdoms prohibited torture of co-religionists. Without very serious causes, but allowed lawful questions in cases of heresy, treason, or crime of lese-majesty. It was enough to frame it correctly. Notaries specialized in this writing, phrases in Latin that said everything without saying anything, complying with the letter of the law while violating the spirit. And it worked. When converted families appealed to civil courts or to the crown itself, the inquisitorial processes were considered correct in form, therefore valid in content. Between 1485 and 1510, more than 40,000 converts left Aragon, Valencia, and Catalonia. There was no expulsion decree, just constant pressure, accumulated fear, the certainty that staying was inviting disaster. Families sold properties in a hurry, usually for half the real value. Buyers, local nobles, old Christian merchants, even officials of the Inquisition itself, knew of the urgency and negotiated without mercy. Notaries certified legally impeccable sales, contract in triplicate, witnessed signatures, payment registered. No one could contest it later. The abandoned synagogues were auctioned by the crown. Some became grain warehouses, others weapon depots. 3 in Barcelona were dismantled stone by stone, and the materials sold for the construction of walls. The revenue, 12,000 florins in Barcelona alone, was divided between the royal treasury and the expenses of the Inquisition. The neighborhoods emptied. Entire streets, where Ladino and Hebrew were once heard, became silent, then were repopulated by old Christian settlers attracted by tax exemptions. In a generation, the urban geography was rewritten. And the records, contracts, inventories, sales certificates, proved that everything had happened legally. The documents do not lie. Each transfer of property followed the law. Each displacement was voluntary. Each silence was a choice. The violence was in the system, not in the papers. In Suffolk, the Papal Palace functioned as the administrative centre of a church that governed territories, collected taxes, maintained armies, and der Exodus war still, aber negotiated treaties. Zwischen 1485 und 1510 verließen mehr als 40.000 convertiten Aragon, Valencia as much as spiritual leaders, and the palace reflected this duality. Magnificent chapel and audience. All, archive of bulls and fortified treasury, cardinals' quarters and prison in the basement. Clerics accused of simony, selling ecclesiastical offices, a practice technically prohibited but widely tolerated, faced a special tribunal presided over by cardinal auditors. The penalty varied according to the severity: fines for minor cases, temporary suspension for intermediaries, and for the most serious, ritualized, public humiliation. The procedure took place in the inner courtyard of the palace, visible from the windows of the cardinals' quarters, but invisible from the external square. Each revolution lasted exactly 2 minutes, enough time for severe disorientation without risk of death. The number of turns corresponded symbolically to the years of irregular service of the cleric, or to the number of positions he sold, or to decades. Of prayers, he should have prayed. The logic varied, but the method did not. And the audience mattered. Cardinals watched from the windows, assessing not only the punishment of the culprit, but the reaction of those present. Loyalties were tested, alliances were confirmed or broken. The spectacle was pedagogical for all. Bishops returned to parish priests, archbishops to simple monks, canons to rural cures in remote villages. Rich dioceses were redistributed among loyal cardinal families, usually French, at the time of the Avignon papacy. The system punished and rewarded simultaneously, and everything was recorded. Minutes of the court, decrees of transfer, patent letters of the new bishops, inventories of diocesan assets. Redistributed, wax guarded what iron imposed. At Cluny Abbey, the heart of the Benedictine reform, silence was the first law. Not just absence of speech, total, absolute silence, broken only by liturgical chants and refectory readings. Monks communicated by coded signals, 63 different gestures for objects, actions, and daily needs. Whoever broke the silence received public penance, prostration in the refectory, fasting, extra work. But repeat offenders faced something more severe, something that never entered the written rule, but was transmitted orally between abbots, from generation to generation. Monastic doctors, each large abbey had its own infirmary with apothecary and bloodletter, performed the procedure. Waxed linen thread, bronze needle, stitches given to the lips with a technique learned in pilgrim hospitals. A small hole in the corner of the mouth allowed drinking thin barley broth. Ointments of honey and burdock prevented infection. The monk returned to the choir, to the cloister, to the library, to the field, continued his regular life, but with his mouth sewn shut. For weeks, sometimes months, until the abbot decided to remove the stitches. The scars remained, vertical lines around the mouth, visible up close. And these scars marked forever. A monk thus marked would never be chosen to preach, teach novices, represent the abbey in general chapters or episcopal councils. He was confined to silent works: copyist, gardener, cook, nurse. The initial silence, broken in minutes, became perpetual silence. And Cluny maintained its reputation. Donations flowed from Frankish kings, counts of Burgundy, dukes of Aquitaine. The impeccable discipline attracted vocations, properties, papal privileges. The price was paid in the infirmaries, away from the eyes of the benefactors. The cost did not appear in the cash books. In German episcopal cities, authorities developed a method that combined punishment, spectacle, and urban pedagogy. Iron cages suspended in church towers. The municipal blacksmith of Munster in 1520 received a detailed order. 3 cages, structure of vertical and horizontal bars, internal. Dimensions of 120 centimeters in height by 50 in width and depth. Too narrow to sit comfortably, too low to stand. Each cage weighed 80 kilos. It had an upper hook for suspension on a forged chain, a side door with a double lock, a grid bottom that allowed excrement to fall directly down. The cost: 35 florins per cage, plus 5 florins annually for maintenance of chains and locks. The city council approved the budget without discussion. Lembert's Tower, 52 meters high, visible from anywhere in the city, received installation of transverse beams at the upper level. The method: condemned heretics were locked alive in the cages, hoisted by pulleys, and left suspended. Death by exposure: cold, heat, rain, wind, hunger, thirst. It lasted days, sometimes weeks, depending on the season and the physical constitution of the condemned. The church bell tolled every hour, day and night, reminding the population. Children grew up seeing the silhouettes swaying against the sky. Merchants learned not to extend stalls under the tower. Excrement, blood, pieces of clothing fell without warning. And the cages remained after death with bones inside until they decomposed completely. Another 6 months, a year. Then they were lowered, summarily cleaned, and were ready for the next use. The system was efficient. 3 cages allowed continuous rotation. There was always at least one occupied, a permanent message of restored order. And other cities copied. Bremen, Osnabrück, Paderborn ordered identical cages from their blacksmiths. Plans circulated among city councils, episcopal councils, cathedral chapters. The urban landscape of northern Germany filled with hanging iron. Munster became synonymous with recovered orthodoxy. Bishops from neighboring dioceses visited to admire the method, and the financial records showed precision. Cost per execution: 15 florins, guard, executioner, priest, notary. Revenue from confiscated goods. Of the condemned, variable but usually more than 50 florins, positive net balance. Order was profitable. At the height of the witch hunts, Bamberg developed its variation. The Prince Bishop Johann Georg II, Fuchs von Dornheim, between 1623 and 1633, oversaw construction of a witch house, a building dedicated exclusively to interrogations and detention of those accused of witchcraft. The architectural project included individual cells, an interrogation room with a fixed table and benches for notaries, and a reformed baptistry. The original baptistry, located on the lower level of the cathedral, was enlarged. Stone tank with 1.5 meters of depth, running water, brought by special channeling, descending steps on 3 sides, lighting by fixed torches. The water, technically baptismal, was kept ice cold, fed by a channeled mountain spring. The procedure: the accused was repeatedly submerged, held by 2 guards while a priest read formulas in Latin. Complete immersion until loss of consciousness, rescue, resuscitation, new immersion. The stated logic: baptismal water purifies, thus forces the truth out. The real logic: a method that left no visible marks, satisfied the requirement of lawful question without violating prohibitions against torments. That permanently mutilated. Notaries recorded confessions obtained, ecclesiastical witnesses certified procedural compliance. Between 1623 and 1632, 600 women were prosecuted in Bamberg. 426 confessed demonic pacts. 350 were executed. The parish records, births, marriages, deaths, show a sudden peak in female deaths from pulmonary fever and sudden illness in the same period. When Swedish troops occupied Bamberg in 1632, interrupting operations of the court, the baptistry was deactivated. Later reform attempted to eliminate permanent moisture stains on the marble floor, failed. The smell of mold persisted. The diocese locked the door, prohibited night baptisms, never explained why. In 1720, during an ordinary episcopal visit, inspectors noted that the room remained closed for conservation reasons. In 1815, during a Napoleonic architectural survey, engineers observed unexplained infiltration on the walls of the basement. No one reopened the door. Records about the original use disappeared from the diocesan archive, possibly destroyed during the 30 Years' War, possibly deliberately removed. What remained was administrative silence, documentary gap, locked door. The crack came from unexpected directions. In 1651, the Jesuit jurist Richard Moore published Cautio Criminalis, a treatise that coldly analyzed the witch trials and concluded that they were legally flawed, logically circular, theologically dubious, and practically designed to generate false confessions. Moore did not deny the existence of witchcraft. He denied that the methods used could identify it. His critique was technical. He demonstrated that anyone subjected to standard procedures would eventually confess anything. And Moore had authority. He had accompanied 200 executions as a confessor, hearing the last words of the condemned. The book was published anonymously, but it circulated. Catholic princes read it. The pressure grew. In parallel, the 30 Years' War shifted priorities. Religious courts lost resources, personnel, political attention. Occupying armies, Swedish Protestants, French Catholics, Bohemian mercenaries, did not respect local ecclesiastical jurisdictions and often freed prisoners or plundered archives. In Bamberg, Swedish soldiers raided the witch house in 1632 and freed all the detainees, burning documents of ongoing trials. The prince-bishop fled. He never returned. Lambert in 1648, not out of compassion, but because they needed the iron for casting cannons. The chains were melted, the bars transformed into ammunition. Only decades later, in 1660, restored municipal authorities commissioned new cages and hung the bodies of the executed Anabaptist. Leaders, now just bones, historical spectacle transformed into a monument of order, but the use against living heretics was never resumed. The change did not come from papal decree or theological reform. It came from administrative exhaustion, logistical collapse, realignment of political priorities. The machine was not dismantled by moral reform. In regions where courts lost momentum, popular memory filled the void. Families of the condemned, those who survived the confiscation of property, the social stigmatization, the forced exile, kept their own records. Hidden letters, secret diaries, annotations on the margins of prayer books, wills with encrypted clauses. Some of these memories surfaced centuries later. In 1870, during the renovation of an old house in Leeds, workers found under floorboards an oak chest containing 53 letters written between 1260 and 1320. They were correspondences from Cathar families, recording forced sales of properties, names of informers, descriptions of court proceedings, fate of relatives. The language was cautious, no direct word against the church or inquisitors, but the stark account of the facts, dates, values, names, sentences. 19th-century historians were perplexed by the documentary coldness. They were not emotional laments. They were precise inventories of losses. One letter listed, "House on Weavers Street, sold to James of Manchester for £60, real value 140. Cooper's Workshop, sold to William the Red for £80, real value 220. Vineyard of 3 hectares sold to the Cathedral Chapter for £110, real value 350. The calculation was exact. The revolt was in the numbers, not in the words. The descendants had documented the confiscation as accountants, not as weeping victims. They understood the language of power. Accounting, Other cracks came from within. Confessors who heard the condemned on the eve of execution began to record disturbing patterns. In Norfolk, a Dominican named Edward Miller kept a private diary between 1530 and 1552, describing his experiences as a confessor of defendants delivered to the secular arm. Of the 187 condemned he confessed, 163 retracted their previous confessions in the last hour, claiming that they had lied under duress. Miller noted, "They tell me that they confessed the impossible, flying to distant mountains, transforming into animals, copulating with demons who have no body. I ask them why they confessed. They answer because they couldn't take it anymore." The diary was discovered in 1928 in the archive of an abandoned convent. Miller never published his observations. It was not safe, it was not prudent, and perhaps he did not know what to do with them. And the record survived. Other confessors were less fortunate. There are indirect references to at least 4 clerics who questioned inquisitorial procedures and were removed from their duties, transferred to remote monasteries, or simply disappeared from diocesan records. The machine protected itself by eliminating internal dissidents before they caused systemic damage. The final dissolution was bureaucratic. Between 1650 and 1780, inquisitorial courts gradually lost jurisdiction, resources, and relevance. Absolutist monarchies centralized justice in civil courts and wanted direct control over confiscations, taxes, and public order. The post-Trent papacy preferred missionary conversion to judicial persecution. The Enlightenment provided an intellectual vocabulary for criticism. Voltaire, Beccaria, Montesquieu attacked judicial torture on rational, not just moral grounds, and the populations themselves were exhausted. Generations of witch hunts, purges of converts, persecutions of heretics had created a climate of permanent suspicion that eroded social trust, commerce, stability. Princes and bishops realized that the machine cost more than it yielded, not only in currency, but in legitimacy. The last execution for heresy in Spain took place in 1784. There was no dramatic decree abolishing the Inquisition. Activities simply ceased, courts closed for lack of cases, officials were relocated, buildings sold or converted for other uses. The Central Archive of Simancas received tons of inquisitorial documents, proceedings, confessions, inventories, accounting records. They were catalogued, boxed, stacked in deep rooms. They remained closed until the 19th century. When historians finally opened them, they found not accounts of irrational fanaticism, but meticulous paperwork of a rational bureaucracy applied to irrational ends. Violence was embedded in the system, not in the system's flaws. Today, place names hold coded memory. Burned Street in Lisbon, Inquisition Square in Cartagena, Witches' Tower in dozens of German cities. Travelers pass by, take pictures, move on, without knowing the precise etymology. Some buildings survive: the Palace of the Inquisition in Lima, now a museum, the Witches' House in Bamberg, demolished in the 19th century but documented in engravings, the Cages of Münster, rebuilt in 1987 as replicas and hung again on the Tower of St. Lambert, now empty, illuminated at night, a tourist attraction. In Toulouse, the building that housed the Episcopal Court is now a municipal archive. Researchers work in rooms where scribes once transcribed confessions. The walls are the same stones, the niches preserve their original shape. Nothing indicates a previous function, only discrete information plaques mentioning medieval judicial use. Now, in Carcassonne, the citadel restored by Viollet-le-Duc in the 19th century has become the setting for films and a destination for school trips. Guides mention Cathar sieges, but rarely what came after: courts, prisons, systematic confiscations. The tourist narrative prefers battles to bureaucracies, heroism to paperwork. Ecclesiastical archives still hold the documents, record after record, process after process, confession after confession. Historians spend years transcribing, cataloguing, analyzing. They find patterns. Peaks of inquisitorial activity correlate with political crises, not theological ones. Confiscations increase when royal treasuries are empty. Accusations of heresy multiply in regions of disputed borders. Heresy was real. People genuinely contested doctrine, refused sacraments, preached alternative theologies. It was administrative, it was fiscal, it was territorial. They built a machine that transformed dissent into revenue, contestation into control, heterodoxy into an architecture of power. And the machine worked for centuries because it was in its way perfect, self-correcting, self-financing, self-legitimizing. Each confession justified the next interrogation. Each confiscation financed the next court. It was a closed circle, impeccable logic, well-oiled machinery. The problem was not technical failure, it was the purpose. Coats of arms of families who profited from confiscations still hang in churches and palaces. Surnames of inquisitors baptize streets and squares. Fortunes built on properties acquired at bargain prices financed universities, hospitals, chapels. The money was laundered through generations, transactions, inheritances. Great-grandchildren of judges became saints. Official memory preserved the names of reforming bishops, legislative popes, unifying kings. Popular memory remembers witches, heretics, martyrs. Between the two, the records tell a different story, of scribes who earned 2 pence per page transcribed, jailers who charged a food fee, blacksmiths who supplied chains at list price, doctors who certified fitness for interrogation, notaries who authenticated forced sales, treasurers who accounted for confiscations, archivists who catalogued proceedings. Thousands of people doing regular work, fulfilling an assigned function, receiving a fair salary, following established protocol. None of them were monsters, all of them were gears. And the machine produced suffering on an industrial scale, documented in triplicate, stamped and filed. The lesson that spans the centuries is not about exceptional cruelty. It is about bureaucratic normality, about how rational systems can serve irrational ends, about how impeccable paperwork can camouflage systemic violence, about how each person involved can claim only to be fulfilling a function, following an order, respecting the law, and all together build a machine. For crushing human lives, the Inquisition was not an aberration. It was not irrationality. And it worked for centuries precisely because it was well organized, well funded, well documented. The worst horrors of history do not come from disorder. They come from excessive order. They are born from rules applied with absolute zeal. They do not emerge from chaos. They emerge from bureaucracy. The room still smells of beeswax and damp parchment. The scribes are no longer there, but their tables remain in museums. The iron chairs were melted down centuries ago, but their descriptions survive in inventories. The notaries are dead, but their certificates fill archives. And all of them, objects, documents, protocols, procedures, whisper the same lesson. True cruelty does not need monsters. A well-designed system, competent people, and an objective considered legitimate are enough. The rest is just ink, wax, and iron. The records do not lie, and that is precisely why they haunt.